Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more A Testament of Hope, the speeches and writings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today we're doing a rather long piece. It is called The Playboy Interview with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Blurb reads, "This interview with Dr. King is one of the finest that we have in print. He discusses a wide range of topics, but especially insightful about his own religious and philosophical motivations for engaging in the struggle for racial justice. The head note written by the Playboy interviewers provides helpful insights into Dr. King's daily routine and gargantuan responsibilities. On the 5th of December, 1955, to the amused annoyance of the white citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, an obscure young Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. called a citywide Negro boycott of its segregated bus system. To their consternation, however, it was almost 100% successful. It lasted for 381 days and nearly bankrupted the bus line. When King's home was bombed during the siege, thousands of enraged Negroes were ready to riot, but the soft-spoken clergyman prevailed on them to channel their anger into nonviolent protest, and he became world-renowned as a champion of Gandhi's philosophy of passive resistance. Within a year, the Supreme Court had ruled Jim Crow seating unlawful on Montgomery's buses, and King found himself a 27 at 27 on the front line of a nonviolent Negro revolution against racial injustice. Moving to Atlanta, he formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an alliance of church-affiliated civil rights organizations which joined such activist groups as CORE and SNCC in a widening campaign of sit-in demonstrations and freedom rides throughout the South. Dissatisfied with the slow pace of the protest movement, King decided to create a crisis in 1963 that would dramatize the Negro plight and galvanize the national conscience. He was abundantly successful for his mass nonviolent demonstration in arch segregationist Birmingham and resulted in the arrest of more than 3,300 Negroes, including King himself, and millions were outraged by the front page pictures of Negro demonstrators being brutalized by the billy sticks, police dogs, and fire hoses of Police Chief Bull Connor. In the months that followed, mass sit-ins and demonstrations erupted in 800 southern cities. President Kennedy proposed a civil rights bill aimed at the enforcement of voting rights, equal employment opportunities, and the desegregation of public facilities. And the now famous March on Washington, 200,000 strong, was eloquently addressed by King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. By the end of that long hot summer, Negro Americans America's Negroes had won more tangible gains than in any year since 1965, and Martin Luther King had become their acknowledged leader and most respected spokesman. He earned in the hard way. He earned it the hard way. In the course of the civil rights work, he has been jailed 14 times and stabbed once in the chest. His home has been bombed 3 times, and his daily mail brings a steady flow of death threats and obscenities. Undeterred, he works 20 hours a day, travels 325,000 miles, and makes 450 speeches a year throughout the country on behalf of the Negro cause. Inundated by callers, and correspondence at his SCLC office in Atlanta, he also time finds time somehow to preach, visit the sick, and help the poor among his congregation at the city's Ebenezer Baptist Church, of which he and his father are the pastors. So heavy, in fact, were his commitments when we called him last summer for an interview that 2 months elapsed before he was able to accept our request for an appointment. We kept it, only to spend a week in Atlanta waiting vainly for him to find a moment for more than an apology and a hurried handshake. A bit less pressed when we returned for a second visit, King was finally able to sandwich in a series of hour and a half conversations with us among the other demands of a grueling week. The resultant interview is the longest he has ever granted to any publication. Through the Though he spoke with heartfelt and often eloquent sincerity, his tone was one of businesslike detachment, and his mood, except for one or two flickering smiles of irony, was gravely serious, never more so than the moment during a rare evening with his family on our first night in town, when his 4 children chided him affectionately for not being home enough. After dinner, we began the interview on his personal on this personal note. Playboy. Dr. King, are your children old enough to be aware of the issues at stake in the civil rights movement and of your role in it? King. Yes, they are, especially my oldest child, Yolanda. 2 years ago, I remember I returned home after serving one of my terms in the Albany, Georgia jail, and she asked me, Daddy, why do you have to go to jail so much? I told her that I was involved in a struggle to make conditions better for the colored people and thus for all people. I explained that because things are as they are, someone has to take a stand that it is necessary for someone to go to jail because many southern officials seek to maintain the barriers that have historically been erected to exclude the colored people. I tried to make her understand that someone had to do this to make the world better for all children. She was only 6 at the time, but she was already aware of segregation because of an experience that we had had. Playboy, would you mind telling us about it? King, not at all. My family is often used to ride with me to the Atlanta airport, and on our way, we always passed Funtown, a sort of a miniature Disneyland with mechanical rides and that sort of thing. Yolanda would inevitably say, I want to go to Funtown, and I would always evade a direct reply. I really didn't know how to explain to her that she couldn't go. Then one day at home, she ran downstairs exclaiming that a TV commercial was urging people to come to Funtown. Then my wife and I had to sit down with her between us and try to explain it. I have won some applause as a speaker, but my tongue twisted and my speech stammered, seeking to explain to my 6-year-old daughter why the public invitation on television didn't include her and others like her. One of the most painful experiences I have ever faced was to see her tears when I told her that Funtown was closed to colored children, for I realized that at that moment the first dark cloud of inferiority had floated into her little mental sky. That at that moment her personality had begun to warp with the first unconscious bitterness toward white people. It was the first time that prejudice had, based upon her skin color, been explained to her. But it was of paramount importance to me that she not grow up bitter. So I told her that although many white people were against her going to Funtown, there were many others who did want colored children to go. It helped somewhat. Pleasantly, word came to me later that Funtown had quietly desegregated, so I took Yolanda. A number of white persons were asked, "Aren't you Dr. King? And isn't this your..." A number of white persons there asked, "Aren't you Dr. King? And isn't this your daughter?" And I said we were. And she heard them say how glad they were to see us there. As in Playboy, as anyone who grew up in the economically comfortable, socially insulated environment of a middle income home in Atlanta, can you recall when it was that you yourself first became painfully and personally aware of social prejudice? King. Very clearly. When I was 14, I had traveled from Atlanta to Dublin, Georgia, with a dear teacher of mine, Mrs. Bradley. She's dead now. I had participated there in an oratorical contest sponsored by the Negro Elks. It turned out to be a memorable day, for I had succeeded in winning the contest. My subject, I recall, ironically enough, was the Negro and the Constitution. Anyway, that night, Mrs. Bradley and I were on the bus returning to Atlanta, and at a small town along the way, some white passengers boarded the bus, and the white driver ordered us to get up and give the whites our seats. We didn't move quickly enough to suit him, so he began cursing us, calling us black sons of bitches. I intended to stay right in that seat, but Mrs. Bradley finally urged me up, saying that we had to obey the law, and so we stood up in the aisle for the 90 miles to Atlanta. That night will never leave my memory. In the It was the angriest I had ever been in my life. Playboy. Wasn't it another such incident on a bus years later that thrust you into your present role as a civil rights leader? King. Yes, it was. In Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, Edie Nixon, a Pullman porter long identified with the NAACP, telephoned me late one night to tell me that Mrs. Rosa Parks had been arrested around 7:30 that evening when a bus driver demanded that she give up her seat, and she refused because her feet hurt. Nixon had already bonded Miss Parks out of prison. He said, "It's time this stops. We ought to boycott the buses." I agreed and said, "Now, the next night we called a meeting of Negro community leaders to discuss it, and on Saturday and Sunday we appealed to the Negro community with leaflets and from the pulpits to boycott the buses on Monday. We had in mind a 1 day boycott and we were banking on 60% success. But the boycott saw instantaneous 99% success. We were so pleasantly surprised and impressed that we continued, and for the next 381 days, the boycott of Montgomery's buses by Negroes was 99.9% successful. Playboy, were you sure you'd win? King, there were some dark moments when we doubted it. We had been struggling to make the boycotts a success when our city of Montgomery successfully obtained an injunction from the court to stop our carpool. I didn't know what to say to our people. They had backed us up and we had let them down. It was a desolate moment. I saw, as all of us saw, that the court was leaning against us. I remember calling a group of those working closest to with me to spread in the Negro community the message. We must have the faith that things will work out somehow, that God will make a way for us when there seems no way. There it was about noontime. I remember when Rex Thomas of the Associated Press rushed over to where I was sitting and told me of the news flash that the U.S. Supreme Court had declared the bus segregation in Montgomery was unconstitutional. It had literally been the darkest hour before the dawn. Playboy, you and your followers were criticized after your arrest for participating in the boycott, for accepting bail and leaving jail. Do you feel in retrospect that you did the right thing? King, no. I think it was a mistake, a tactical error for me to to have left jail by accepting bail after being indicted along with 125 others, mainly drivers of our carpool, under an old law of doubtful constitutionality and anti boycott ordinance. I should have stayed in prison. It would have nationally dramatized and deepened our movement even earlier, and it would once more quickly aroused and keened America's conscience. Playboy, do you feel you've been guilty of any comparable errors in judgment since then? King, yes, I do. In Albany, Georgia in 1962. If I had that to do again, I would guide the community's Negro leadership differently than I did. The mistake I made there was to protest against segregation generally rather than against a single and distinct facet of it. Our protest was so vague that we got nothing, and the people were left very depressed and in despair. It would have been much better to have concentrated upon integri- integrating the buses or the lunch counters. One victory of this kind would have been symbolic, would have galvanized support and boosted morale. But don't mean that our work in Albany ended in failure. The Negro people there straightened up their bent backs. You can't ride a man's back unless it's bent. Also, thousands of Negroes registered to vote who never had voted before, and because of the expanded Negro vote in the next election for governor of Georgia, which pitted a moderate candidate against a rabid segregationist, Georgia elected its first governor who had pledged to respect and enforce the law impartially. And what we learned from our mistakes on Albany helped our later campaigns in other cities to be more effective. We have never since scattered our efforts in a general attack on segregation, but have focused upon specific symbolic objectives. Playboy, can you recall any other mistakes you have made leading the movement? King, well, the most pervasive mistake I made was in believing that because our cause was just, we could be sure that the white ministers of the South, since their Christian consciences were challenged, would rise to our aid. I felt that white ministers would take our cause to the white power structures. I ended up, of course, chastened and disillusioned. As our movement unfolded and direct appeals were made to white ministers, most folded their hands, and some even took stands against us. Playboy. Their stated reason for refusing to help was that it was not the proper role of the church to intervene in secular affairs. Do you disagree with this view? King. Most emphatically. The essence of the epistles of Paul and the that is that Christians should reject at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believe. The projections of a social gospel, in my opinion, is the true witness of a Christian life. This is the meaning of the true ecclesia, the inner spiritual church. The church once changed society. It was then a thermostat of society, but today I feel that too much of the church is merely a thermometer which measures rather than molds people's opinion. Playboy, are you speaking of the church in general or of the white church in particular? King, the white church, I'm sorry to say. Its leadership has greatly disappointed me. Let me hasten to say that there are some outstanding exceptions. As one whose Christian roots go back through three generations of ministers, my father, grandfather, and great grandfather. I will remain true to the church as long as I live. But the laxity of the white church collectively has caused me to weep tears of love, and there cannot be deep disappointment without deep love. Time and again in my travels, as I have seen the outward beauty of white churches, I have had to ask myself what kind of people worship there? Who is their God? Is their God the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And is their Savior the Savior who hung on the cross at Golgotha? Where were their voices when a black race took upon itself the code of protest, the cross of protest against man's injustice to man? Where were their voices when defiance and hatred were by called for by white men who sat in these very churches? At the Negro struggles against grave injustice, most white churchmen offer pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. As you say, they claim that the gospel of Christ should have no concern with social issues. Yet, white churchgoers who insist that they are Christians practice segregation as rigidly as in the house of God as they do in the movie houses. Too much of the white church is timid and ineffectual and some of it is shrill in its defense that bigotry and prejudice. In most communities, the spirit of status quo is endorsed by the churches. My personal disillusionment with the church began when I was thrust into the leadership of the bus boycott in Montgomery. I was confident that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would prove strong allies in our just cause. But some became open adversaries, some cautiously shrank from the issue, and others hid behind silence. My optimism about help from the white church was shattered, and on too many occasions since, my hopes for the white church have been dashed. There are many signs that the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. Unless the early sacrificial spirit is recaptured, I am very much afraid that today's Christian church will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and will see the Christian church dismissed as a social club with no meaning or effectiveness for our time, as a form without substance, as salt without savor. The real tragedy, though, is not Martin Luther King's disillusionment with the church, for I am sustained by the spiritual blessings as a minister of the gospel with a lifelong commitment. The tragedy is that in my travels, I meet young people of all races whose disenchantment with the church has soured into outright disgust. Playboy. Do you feel that the Negro church has come any closer to the projection of a social gospel in its commitment to the cause? King. I must say that when any Southern Christian white leadership conference begins its work in Birmingham, we encountered numerous Negro church reactions that had to be overcome. Negro ministers were among other Negro leaders who felt that they were being pulled into something that they had not help to organize. This is almost always a problem. Negro community unity was the first requisite if our goals were to be realized. I talked with many groups, including one group of 200 ministers. My theme to them being that a minister cannot preach the glories of heaven while ignoring social conditions in his own community that cause men an earthly hell. I stressed that the Negro minister had particular freedom and independence to provide strong, firm leadership, and I asked how the Negro would ever gain freedom without his minister's guidance, support of inspiration, support and inspiration. These ministers finally decided to entrust our movement with their support, and as a result, the role of the Negro Church today, by and large, is a glorious example in the history of Christendom. For never in Christian history within a Christian country have Christian churches been on the receiving end of such naked brutality and violence as we were witnessing here in America today. Not since the days of the Christians in the catacombs has God's house, as a symbol, weathered such attack as the Negro churches. I shall never forget the grief and bitterness I felt on that terrible September morning when a bomb blew out the lives of those four little innocent girls sitting in their Sunday school class in the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. I think of how a woman cried out, crunching through broken glass, "My God, we're not even safe in church." I think of how that explosion blew the face of Jesus Christ from a stained glass window. It was symbolic of how sin and evil had plotted out the life of Christ. I can remember thinking that if men were this bestial, was it all worth it? Was there any hope? Was there any way out? Playboy. Do you still feel this way? King. No. Time has healed the wounds and buoyed me with the inspiration of another moment, which I shall never forget. When I saw with my own eyes over 3,000 young Negro boys and girls, totally unarmed, leave Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church to march on a prayer meeting, ready to pit nothing but the power of their bodies and souls against Bull Connor's police dogs, clubs, and fire hoses. When they refused Connor's bellowed order to turn back, he whirled and shouted to his men to turn on the hoses. It was one of the most fantastic events of the Birmingham story that these Negroes, many of them on their knees, stared unafraid and unmoving at Connor's men with the hose nozzles in their hands. Then slowly the Negroes stood up and advanced, and Connor's men fell back as though hypnotized as the Negroes marched on past to hold their prayer meeting. I saw there, I felt there, for the first time, the pride and the power of nonviolence. Another time I will never forget was one Saturday night, late, when my brother telephoned me in Atlanta from Birmingham, that city which some call Birmingham, which I had just left. He told me that a bomb had wrecked his home and that another bomb, positioned to exert its maximum force upon the motel room in which I had been staying, had injured several people. My brother described the terror in the streets as Negroes, furious at the bombings, fought whites. Then, behind his voice, I heard a rising chorus of beautiful singing. We shall overcome. Tears came into my eyes that at such a tragic moment my race still could sing its hope and faith. Playboy. We shall overcome is becoming the unofficial song and slogan of the civil rights movement. Do you consider such inspirational anthems important to morale? King. In a sense, songs are the soul of a movement. Consider in World War II, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and in World War One, over there and Tipperary, and during the Civil War, Battle Hymn of the Republic and John Brown's Body. A Negro song anthology would include sorrow songs, shouts for joy, battle hymns, anthems. Since slavery, the Negro has sung throughout his struggle in America. Still away and go down, Moses, were the songs of faith and inspiration which were sung on the plantations. For the same reasons the slaves sang. Negroes today sing freedom songs, for we too are in bondage. We sing out our determination that we shall overcome, black and white together. We shall overcome someday. I should also mention a song parody that I enjoyed very much, which the Negroes sang during our campaign in Albany, Georgia. It goes, I'm coming, the campaign in Albany, Georgia. It goes, I'm coming, I'm coming. And my head ain't bending now. I'm walking tall and I'm talking strong. I'm America's new Black Joe, Playboy. Your detractors in the Negro community often refer to you snidely as Delawed and Booker T. King. What's your reaction to this sort of Uncle Tom label? King. I hear some of those names but my reaction to them is never emotional. I don't think you can be in public life without being called bad names. As Lincoln said, if I answered all criticism, I'd have time for nothing else. But the regard to both of the names you mentioned, I've always tried to be what I call militantly nonviolent. I don't believe that anyone could seriously accuse me of not being totally committed to the breakdown of segregation. Playboy, what do you mean by militantly nonviolent? King, I mean to say that a strong man must be militant as well as moderate. He must be a realist as well as an idealist. If I am to merit the trust invested in me by some of my race, I must be both of these things. This is why nonviolence is a powerful as well as a just weapon. If you confront a man who has long been cruelly misusing you and say, "Punish me," if you will, I do not deserve it, but I will accept it, so that the world will know I am right and you are wrong. Then you wield a powerful and just weapon. This man, your opponent, is automatically morally defeated, and if he has any conscience, he is ashamed. Wherever this weapon is used in a manner that stirs a community's or a nation's anguished conscience, then the pressure of public opinion becomes an ally in your just cause. Another of the major strengths of the nonviolent weapon is its strange power to transform and transmute the individuals who subordinate themselves to its disciplines, investing them in with a cause that is larger than themselves. They become, for the first time, somebody's, and they have for the first time the courage to be free. When the Negro finds the courage to be free, he faces dogs and guns and clubs and fire hoses totally unafraid. And the white men with those dogs, guns, clubs, and fire hoses see that the Negro they have traditionally called boy has become a man. We should not forget that although nonviolent direct action did not originate in America, it found a natural home where it has been a revered tradition to rebel against injustice. This great weapon, which was first tried out in Montgomery during the bus boycott, has been further developed throughout the South over the past decade until by today it has become instrumental in the greatest mass action crusade for freedom that has ever occurred in America since the Revolutionary War. The effectiveness of this weapon's ability to dramatize in the world's eyes an oppressed people's struggle for justice is evident in the fact that of 1963's top 10 news stories after the assassination of President Kennedy was the events immediately connected with it. 9 stories dealt with the aspect or another of the Negro struggle. Playboy. Several of those stories dealt with your own nonviolent campaigns against segregation in various southern cities, where you and your followers have been branded rabble rousers and outside agitators. Do you feel that you've earned these labels? King. Wherever the early Christians spreading Christ's doctrine of love, the resident power structure accused them of being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the small Christian band continued to teach and exemplify love, convinced that they were a colony of heaven on this earth who were missioned to obey not man, but God. If those of us who employ nonviolent direct action today are dismissed by our white brothers as rabble rousers and outside agitators, if they refuse to support our nonviolent efforts and goals, we can be assured that the summer of 1965 will be no less long and hot than the summer of 1964. Our white brothers must be made to understand that nonviolence is a weapon fabricated of love. It is a sword, it is a sword that heals. Our nonviolent direct action program has as its objective not the creation of tensions, but the surfacing of tensions already present. We set out to precipitate a crisis situation that must open the door to negotiation. I am not afraid of the words crisis and tension. I deeply oppose violence, but constructive crisis and tensions are necessary for growth. Innate in all life and all growth is tension. Only in death is there an absence of tension. To cure injustices, you must expose them before the light of human conscience and the bar of public opinion, regardless of whatever tensions that exposure generates. Injustices to the Negro must be brought out into the open where they cannot be evaded. I'm going to stop right here because this is a long one, as I said. So that will be part one. I'll continue this interview in the next uh, Dr. King video. But yeah, as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Those who have been working on the front lines during the COVID pandemic, your efforts are appreciated no matter how some people act. But I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.